How do you remove asbestos? Hi, I'm Kyber with PatchBoyz Ottawa Asbestos Removal, and today we'll talk a little bit more about how to go about this and whether it's worth the risk for you and your family. First off, I want to say that anything said in this video does not constitute legal advice or contractual advice or any type of advice for construction or the procedures of how to remove asbestos. My professional recommendation is that if you're going to take on this kind of work, you take the time to take the course. It's multiple days long, and there's a reason for that. The regulations are complex and seem to overlap, and you really need to have the experience to understand these regulations and how they all fit together. Legally speaking, you can do asbestos removal in your own home. However, it's important to remember that you have a fiduciary duty to anybody in your home. So especially if you have other adults in the home, you have to get their consent, and then hopefully you have the best interests of any minors in the home. Now, how do you go about this? There are technically four different types of asbestos removal. You have type 1, 2, 3. You have type 2 modified and glove bag. And each one of these different methods and series of procedures and containment measures are applicable to different materials, different quantities, and different ways of removal. What I mean by different ways of removal, sometimes you scrape, sometimes you remove, sometimes you're cutting it, sometimes you're cutting it with dustless equipment, sometimes you're wetting it while cutting it before and after. And those removal methods, power tools versus no power tools, those removal methods are to be combined with certain procedure methods and certain materials to fit into type 1, type 2, or type 3. So you really have to understand the regulations to know what you can do in a type 1, what you can do in a type 2, and what you have to do in a type 3. Type 3 is the biggest, the baddest, and is used for the most friable asbestos and larger footprints. And a type 3 removal requires a dirty room, shower room, clean room, notice of project to the city, negative air during the entire time, a capnometer, and a third-party air quality test before taking down the containment. Now, this third-party quality test is recommended. It can be done by the same organization, but there can be a conflict of interest there. If you're doing it, well, there's a conflict of interest, but it's your own home. The type 2 is for slightly less friable asbestos or certain situations where you're using dustless equipment and you're using wetting methods and the containment measures are reduced. There's no room for a shower room and a change room. It's good to still have a change room for regular changing, but you don't need to have several of the measures of type 3. And then type 1 is for smaller footprint removal of the least type of friable asbestos and the least harmful, such as chrysotile. You would have tremolite on the high end and then chrysotile on the lower end of the danger spectrum due to the composition of the asbestos fibers. Chrysotile will just be like a needle, whereas tremolite will be a needle with a hook at the end. And we all know it's a lot harder to get a hook out of a fish than it would be to pull a needle out of a fish. And it's the same concept. Those are not by no means the only two types of asbestos. You have chrysotile, amosite, tremolite, and then there are a series of others that are a little less common in residential home construction. Now, before we continue, I want to say this. The amount of time and money you will spend and the amount of money you will save is usually not worth the risk on your family. If you contaminate your home, you're technically supposed to, and rightfully so, you're supposed to throw out anything fabric. So we're talking couches, mattresses, clothing, carpets, everything. Because once those things are contaminated, you can't get that stuff cleaned. There are some specific places that clean asbestos contaminated clothing, but the rest of the stuff, it has to go. So the amount of money you would spend on taking care of all that would be drastic. But more importantly, if you contaminate your home and do not pay for a full home decontamination, you're in a closed air environment and you're exposing your family repeatedly, especially during the winter when you have all the windows closed, repeatedly to the asbestos. And nothing will happen in the short term, but the long term, you are bringing on the possibility of asbestosis, lung cancer, mesothelioma, as well as a range of other potential pulmonary complications. So it really has to be weighed out properly, and you really have to consider if that's worth it for you and your family. There are YouTube tutorials, and I've watched a lot of these YouTube tutorials, and a lot of them have no idea what they're talking about. There is one particular tutorial where this gentleman is showing how to take a sample to be tested for asbestos. He's not wearing a mask. He's not using any wetting procedures. He doesn't have a tarp underneath. His kids are right behind him, so he contaminates himself, his kids, collects the sample improperly, and doesn't wrap up the procedure properly. And people are going about learning this stuff from a gentleman that has no idea what he's doing. So that's another caution, is there are people that know how to do this stuff very well, and there are people that pretend to know how to do this stuff. And it's up to you to decide who the real pros are and who you're going to trust to learn this from, or who to contract to do this. Equipment cost. As I mentioned, there are huge equipment costs. It's not only the cost of setting up the containment and the zip pulls and the zip doors, and then the equipment to remove. Perhaps you're buying dustless equipment. If you're buying a negative air machine, it's $800 for a good machine. And you're going about doing all this, and then you're going to have that equipment sitting. Once the project is done, unless you're going into the business, that equipment is going to sit, and we all know how we need to buy larger homes for all the stuff we have. You're usually better off just having a professional do it, and if it's a smaller project, the minimum will usually be less than the cost of buying all this equipment. Yeah, yes, it can be expensive, but then you don't have all this stuff that you don't need. I need to maintain and clean and change filters on. There are places that sell this type of equipment, and if you're going to go ahead, I highly recommend that you seek out places that specifically sell hazardous material equipment. There are people at Home Depots that claim they understand this stuff, and not to say anything about Home Depot, but I have an associate who decided to try and do this stuff himself. He's a plumber, very great plumber, an amazing plumber, but not trained in asbestos. And this gentleman went to Home Depot, sought the advice of a gentleman there, bought a suit, and we were chatting after he did his work in his personal home, and he was zipping over somewhere, and he said, "Not to worry, I wore a suit." And I look at him, and he's driving his van, and I said, "Is that the suit you were wearing? The suit you forgot to doff?" So he was still wearing his contaminated suit in the van, which means that he contaminated the seats of his van. And furthermore, as I look further at the suit, I realize it's not a Tyvek suit, it's a fabric suit. So that suit was fully contaminated and contaminated his clothes underneath, some expensive clothes. And so this gentleman is very bright, he's very capable. But if you're not used to thinking about every single aspect of contamination, the way some people were trained to during COVID, for example, where you understand that it's not just you, but your footwear, whatever you have on your person, your mask, the walls, the ceilings, the fixtures, the floors, the HVAC, the handles, anything you touched. If you grab your phone and then brought it out of containment, that's contaminated. Everything you touch, kind of like E. coli in a kitchen, it spreads so fast. If you've seen any of those videos where they do the experiment with the black light and a fake contaminant, and it just spreads so quickly. And it's the same thing here. If you haven't been trained to think like this, and you haven't been trained for the removal procedures, this quickly gets out of hand, and you do contaminate things quickly with the asbestos fibers. So that's an easy comparison. We all went through that, and it was scary, but we learned how to do things a specific way. And for some of us, it was just so hard to continuously be mindful of every little detail. And that's what our experts are trained to do. Our technicians are licensed in this, and we think about every step. Every piece of equipment gets decontaminated. Every bag full of asbestos fibers gets decontaminated before leaving the containment. So these are all steps in the process, and very much important, very much worth learning before you decide to take on this project. In the end, we'd be happy to give you a free estimate and give you an idea of what it costs. That way you can weigh out what the difference in cost for doing it yourself would be compared to doing it with us. And at the end of the day, if you still want to do it yourself, we'll wish you the best of luck and hope that you read the regulations. And even more so, we would hope that you would take a course to make sure you protect yourself and your loved ones. I'm Kyber with PatchBoyz Ottawa Asbestos Removal, and I look forward to speaking with you and seeing if our two families work well together. Thank you.